All right, so this is a review for Unit 4. We're going to focus, this lecture is going to focus on Key Concept 4.1. So the overriding concept, 4.11, is it's the intensification of all existing patterns of trade that brought prosperity and economic disruption to the merchants and governments in the trading regions of the Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, Sahara, and overland Eurasia. And pay attention to the two words, prosperity and disruption, right? Some regions prospered, some regions did not or were disrupted by trade. All right, so the first, some of the supporting evidence would be obviously to understand the impact of Columbus, right? So he's going to open the door to the Atlantic trade system. Obviously, the Spanish and Portuguese are going to depend on the silver from the New World that would later be minted into a currency known as the peso de ocho. But the idea of silver, right, being a major um, uh, item that Europeans sought for their economies, and would obviously be important to the Chinese economies, Japanese economies. So silver is going to be a major, I wouldn't say good, but something that's going to really change the way business is done. The Spanish are going to have colonies all over the world, in the Pacific, in the Philippines, for example. As I mentioned, a lot of the New World silver will end up in China. The Chinese really, um, you know, uh, were really relied on it, right? So the Chinese aren't really importing goods; they're exporting things, but they're exporting and buying things, or at least getting silver in exchange for those goods. And don't forget Zheng He, right? He's going to be the Chinese explorer that opens China up to the Indian Ocean trade, a much larger fleet than Columbus and the Portuguese. And initially, it's going to open China up to not only things from India and Africa, but Chinese workers are going to leave and go work in other places, in other ports. So that leads to a labor migration out of China. But eventually, this actually turned, as a result of Zheng He, we're going to see China become more isolated during the Qing dynasty around the 1300s. This fear of traditional values and customs being threatened by this open door, or this being exposing China to outsiders, or losing Chinese workers or Chinese scholars. Other supporting pieces of evidence would be how the Portuguese and Spain tried to monopolize the Indian Ocean trade. Eventually, Portugal would kind of be the dominant force in the Indian Ocean. And that's going to lead to the downfall of African cities, right? And the fall of Malacca. Malacca is an important little city in Malaysia, right, that basically became or was put under the control of the Portuguese. So, the local communities are going to be dominated by the Portuguese. Um, and that's important, right? That's the downfall of this trade system. Um, the weakening of smaller nations. The incorporation of West Africa. So we know that the Atlantic system, or the triangular trade system, led to the Atlantic, or was part of that would be the Atlantic trade, the slave trade, and that's going to impact West Africa, mostly probably negatively, but there were some positive aspects in terms of the foods that were brought over to the African people. But mostly, when you lose, a great, an important part of your population, that's not going to be really, a good thing. Um, and as Da Gama, as the Portuguese make it to India and in Asia, um, remember Da Gama opens up this new trade network to India, where Europeans or Western Europeans don't have to rely on this silk trade, and that's going to impact the cities like Constantinople. That's going to impact those Ottoman middlemen who aren't necessarily needed anymore, and obviously the impact of the Silk Road trade as a whole is going to be weakened, and the Sahara trade route. So these new ocean trade networks are definitely going to weaken the significance of those overland trade networks. All right, so key concept 4.12 states European technological developments in cartography and navigation built on previous knowledge developed in the classical Islamic and Asian worlds, and included the production of new tools, innovations in ship designs, and an improved understanding of global wind and current patterns, all of which made transoceanic trade and travel possible. So, what do you have to be able to articulate? These technological developments, right? What are the new innovations that helped Columbus and Da Gama and even Zheng He? So the caravel would be the European ship that was a little faster than the older model, so that allowed Columbus and Da Gama to travel quickly. The compass from China obviously helped explorers determine their location. The astrolabe from Middle Eastern innovators, and also better understanding of currents and winds. And remember, Prince Henry the Navigator, he has this school in Portugal that's going to help train these explorers and also teach cartography, which is the study of maps. So definitely be able to, identify some of those new technological advancements. And don't forget the understanding of those winds. That's important too. All right, 4.13 states remarkable new transoceanic maritime reconnaissance occurred in this period. So what do you have to do is you have to basically summarize some of these journeys, right? So the Portuguese are going to be the early leaders, right? They're going to be the first to explore or go around the coast of Africa and establish trading posts throughout Asia and India. Prince Henry the Navigator is the instructor. He's going to train Da Gama, who makes it to India by boat, and they're going to set up these trading posts in locations like Malacca in Malaysia. Trading posts all along the eastern and western coasts of Africa. They're going to be the first to enslave Africans and send those Africans to Portugal, to Brazil in the sugar plantations. And obviously, Zheng He is important to this as well. He is going to, I shouldn't put him here, but always remember he's competing with the Portuguese, right? He's also exploring during this time. All right, evidence B states Spanish sponsorship of the first Columbian and subsequent voyages across the Atlantic and Pacific dramatically increased European interest in transoceanic travel and trade. So definitely be able to summarize some of the Spanish explorers like Columbus in 1492. Don't forget, the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella bankrolled his voyages, right? So he did have, some support, patronage, right? He didn't have the money for this, so the Spanish are going to promote this, or the Spanish rulers are going to promote this. And what is he looking for? Remember, he's trying to get to India. He's looking for spices. He just lands in America and really not even realizing where he was. So originally, again, his goal is to seek out that trade network to India, kind of follow Da Gama, but go in a different location or different route. And Ferdinand Magellan's voyage, he goes all around the world. He doesn't make it. He's killed in the Philippines. But he does manage to circumnavigate the globe and establish a Spanish colony in the Philippines. Evidence C. States northern Atlantic crossings for fishing and settlements continued and spurred European searches for multiple routes. So you want to be able to identify some of the French and English explorers. And I'm going to focus mostly on England's role in exploration. John Cabot was an Italian, but he sailed for England, and he's going to explore North America, Canada, parts of the United States. Early on, the English were interested in Caribbean colonies, and they will establish colonies in Jamaica, Barbados, but eventually, they're going to focus on North America. They believe that they can travel through North America, through the Northwest Passage, to get to India. They were kind of wrong. It wasn't really there, but instead they established colonies in America, or the United States. The Virginia colony was the first English colony in 1607, and by 1630, the English had a pretty successful colony, mostly due to tobacco. They will engage in the African slave trade eventually, but early on, they're going to bring indentured servants, right? English men who are going to come over here, their voyage will be paid for, and they will work in America on those tobacco farms and work off their debt. They were problematic at times, and because they weren't as effective or as efficient as the leaders of the colony wanted them to be. Eventually, they were replaced by African slaves. And the British East India Company, one of those joint stock companies that sponsored a lot of these colonial voyages to Virginia. And don't forget the Puritans, right? The Puritans come over here for, to escape persecution in Europe. They want to purify the Catholic or the Church of England. It's too Catholic, and they're persecuted because of that. And they come over here and they establish a colony in Massachusetts. All right, key concept 4.14 states the new global circulation of goods was facilitated by royal chartered European monopoly companies that took silver from Spanish companies in the Americas to purchase Asian goods for the Atlantic by using established commercial practices and new transoceanic shipping services developed by European merchants. So the key words here would be these companies, right, the joint stock companies, and also commercial practices, new ways of doing business, and that's probably related to the term mercantilism. All right, so evidence A, European merchants' role in Asian trade was characterized mostly by transporting goods from one Asian country to another in Asia or the Indian Ocean region. So the Dutch were actually trading in India. They had the Dutch East India Company. And they're going to kind of lead the way to the modern commercial capitalism. They're going to have their own almost private trading companies like the Dutch East India Company. They're going to have very advanced ship design. So they're actually establishing trade networks in India after the Portuguese do. So the Portuguese open it up, the Dutch kind of follow. Eventually, the Dutch will even kind of move into North America. The Dutch bought and owned the island of Manhattan for a little while. And the colony of New York. Eventually, it was sold to England, but the Dutch were also a very influential trading nation as well. All right, Portugal. We've talked about Portugal. They established these ports and trading networks. For example, the city of Malacca became a very important trading center or city in Malaysia. Right in a very important part of kind of a strait, which made it easier to sail from the Indian Ocean into other parts of Indonesia. The Portuguese, didn't always have goods that Indian traders wanted, but they still were they were kind of moving goods. So they would actually transport gunpowder to China or to Japan, for example. So they were kind of middlemen. In addition to bringing goods back to Europe, they also, again, facilitated trade between, say, Africa and Japan and China. Eventually, they would have a monopoly on the spice trade, and they would kind of dominate this region. The Indian Ocean trade was also driven by silver. We talked about that, right? So the Portuguese and the Spanish would bring silver and buy Chinese and Indian goods. Silk, for example, cotton, with that silver that they had mined in South America or Central America. All right, evidence B states commercialization and the creation of a global economy were intimately connected to the new global circulation of silver. Again, there is this emphasis on how important silver was, right, and how the world depended on it. It got to that point. So remember, Native Americans or American Indians are going to be doing the mining, which is going to be very difficult and harsh at times. The Mughal dynasty, the Indian Mughals, wanted silver for payment for pepper, so they would trade pepper for silver. Obviously, the Chinese would sell silk for silver. It was really one of their coveted imports. On the downside, Europe was flooded with silver, and that led to inflation. I don't think they complained too much because there was a lot of great wealth that came about in Europe, but it did lead to a rise in prices. All right, evidence C states influenced by mercantilism, joint stock companies were new methods used by European rulers to control their domestic and colonial economies and by European merchants to compete against one another in global trade. So you definitely want to be able to define the term mercantilism. What is it? It's this, and this is a new economic philosophy or a practice. It's the idea of a mother country like Spain would accumulate or gain colonies um, because of the wealth that they would provide. It might be the raw materials like silver, or it would be these locations, a colony would provide a market for European goods, right? So the colonies existed to serve the mother country. Um, Mercantilism also was this idea that it was in the parent country's best interest to export more than you imported. So tariffs were often used to tax goods coming in to encourage, their people to buy obviously goods that are produced there. And again, the goal would be to establish colonies and obtain gold and silver to increase the wealth of the parent country. So, important term, definitely remember it. It is a term that, or it is a system that really was practiced by all European countries. If they had colonies, they were practicing mercantilism. Think of merchandise, right? Merchandise. The British East India Company was one of these joint stock companies. Remember, what's a joint stock company? It's an early corporation. Uh, Businessmen would invest in this company. They would share not only in the profits but in the loss. But because there was more than one investor, if there was a problem, if the company went bankrupt, you wouldn't lose as much, right? It was less risk involved. But these companies were, again, early corporations like Apple or McDonald's, right? The two famous ones would be the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company, they did have a monopoly in the Indian Ocean region, and they would do that through force. They definitely used their military power to kind of, dominate the trade system. They had advanced ships, as I mentioned, and they made tremendous profits from the spice trade. And you guys did a little reading about the Dutch East India Company. They were pretty brutal to local native people at times as well. So these corporations definitely, were engaged in some brutality. All right, evidence D states the Atlantic system involved the movement of goods, wealth, and free and unfree laborers and the mixing of American, African, and European cultures and people. So this focuses on two things: the free and unfree laborers, the movement of workers, the movement of goods, and obviously the mixing of culture and people. So let's talk about just the movement of goods. The Atlantic system is also called the triangular trade. We've studied that before. Remember, manufactured goods are being made in Europe, whether it's guns or shoes or clothing. They're going to be sent out of out of Europe to Africa, to the Americas. Obviously, humans, African slaves were sent out of Africa to the Caribbean, and then obviously the United States, where they would obviously perform slave labor. The colonies, as part of mercantilism, would provide the raw materials, right? Barbados would, they would export sugar to the United States or to the American colonies or to England, or tobacco or timber. Again, in return, they would receive the finished goods, like clothing. Um, the Indian Ocean trade did play a role in that. Goods from China were mixed into that, right? So those goods did make their way over to the Americas as well. So we always want to remember that the Indian Ocean trader, what was being, silk, for example, made its way to the Americas. No doubt about that. Cotton made its way from India to the Americas. So that's always something to remember. There was a lot of competition, and that led to military conflict. England and France were always fighting each other over control of North America. The famous 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which ultimately led to the American Revolution, is one great example of that conflict. England and Spain were involved in a famous battle. Queen Elizabeth sent her great naval commanders to attack the Spanish Armada and pretty much defeated the Spanish pretty handily, and that gave England kind of control of the Atlantic trade network. So there was a lot of conflict back and forth between these powers. And African slaves, right? 12 million were taken from Africa along the Middle Passage to work in the Caribbean, sugar plantations, and also eventually to work on tobacco plantations and rice plantations in the 13 colonies. So we talk about mixing, right? We know that there were in the Spanish colonies, you had the mestizos, who were it was a mix of the Spanish and Amerindian. The mulatto would be a mix of Spanish and African, so we see that cultural assimilation. Don't forget the combination of religions, right? So these Amerindians would mix their beliefs with Christianity. Um, so for example, they would worship Mary as the Virgin Mother of Christ, and that kind of allowed them to incorporate, or at least kind of, continue their belief of a fertility goddess. There was the cult of the Virgin Guadalupe in 1531 when a peasant in Mexico saw a vision of the Virgin Mary, and that, that got transformed into statues where the Virgin Mary might have been darkened a bit. So again, it's just basically you're seeing Amerindian or Native Americans embracing Catholic sacraments and traditions and icons. And in Haiti, the Haitian natives mixed their kind of their local religion with Christianity to produce something called Bandun. So definitely be able to explain that mixing of religion. All right, key concept 4.15. The new connections between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere resulted in the Columbian Exchange. So you definitely want to be able to explain the positive and negative effects of the Columbian Exchange. We did a DBQ on this, I think, didn't we? Maybe we didn't, I forget. So evidence A, European colonization of the Americas led to the spread of disease, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, that were endemic in the Eastern Hemisphere among Amerindian populations, and the unintentional transfer of vermin. So in short, disease, right? Disease will come over to the Americas from Europe and devastate populations there. Evidence B, American foods became staple crops in various parts of Europe. So what things from America made their way to Europe? And remember, these goods are going to help European populations, right? These are healthier foods, so that's going to improve the diet of Europeans. So what came out of America? Sugar, potatoes, tomatoes, pumpkins, and tobacco. You could argue that tobacco wasn't such a great thing, right? Leading to lung cancer and other problems and other diseases. Evidence C, what things basically were brought to the Americas in addition to disease, right? We have cattle, horses, pigs, coffee, wheat. Remember, horses did help local natives travel and hunt, but the environmental impact was great. Cattle and pigs, they're going to basically be eating grass. That's going to impact the vegetation and habitat of American. And don't forget the waste, right? The pig waste or the cow waste that's going to impact the environment as well. And I wouldn't, I don't know if wheat was always a great, wheat isn't the greatest thing for anyone's diet. So that probably contributed to some dietary problems with American Indians. All right, evidence D, populations in Europe benefited, definitely right. Not just in Europe, but also in Africa too. These healthier foods made their way to both regions, and that led to rising populations and longer life expectancies. All right, evidence E, European colonization and the introduction of European agricultural and settlement practices in the Americas often affected the physical environment through deforestation and soil depletion. So what you want to be able to articulate is the Columbian Exchange, the negative impact was environmental, whether it was the cutting down of trees, which impacts local habitats, again, just pollution in general, water pollution. We don't really have air pollution yet. You're not going to see factories, but overall, you're going to see, the natural American environment deteriorate. All right, key concept 4.16, the increase in interactions between newly connected hemispheres and intensification of connections within hemispheres expanded the spread and reform of existing religions and created syncretic belief systems and practices. And we've kind of talked about some of those already. Let's talk about Sufism, right? So it's not just in the Americas, we're talking about all around the world. So Sufism, if you remember, is it's modification of Islam, right? And you're going to see Sufism, a lot of missionary work. They're going to spread Islam to, Asia. Sufis kind of emphasized this idea of, hey, you know what? you can have a personal relationship with God. You don't have to necessarily follow Sharia law or follow the Quran. It's basically emphasizing a mystical approach over formal practices and creeds, right? They sought emotional encounters that brought them in union with God. Again, they spread Islam. One, they did beg for food and did not own homes. Um, and they were wandering mystics. So, without realizing it, they actually became missionaries. They didn't seek that necessarily. But by, again, going out, wandering and begging, they were able to kind of spread Islam. They're known, Sufism is known for its rhythmic dancing, singing, and chanting. So, still, this belief in a single God, basic, a belief in Muhammad as a prophet. It's just they weren't as strict in their daily beliefs, and I think that's kind of reminds you of the changes that Protestantism enveloped, right? How they kind of sought a different Christian practices. And that takes us to Lutheranism. Remember Martin Luther? Definitely remember him. He's going to change, or he's going to introduce kind of a new religion, a new Christian religion called Protestantism or Lutheranism. Remember, he objects to the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, that idea that if you pay the church, you can be free from sin. A lot of wasteful spending, a lot of sinful behavior by leaders and priests, and he nails his beliefs to the door of the Wittenberg Church in Germany as a protest, and that was his 95 thesis, right? His 95 complaints. And eventually, he's going to develop converts. He's going to develop a following, and it's going to lead to a new Christian religion called Protestantism. And the bigger picture is that by challenging the church, by questioning the church, by challenging authority, that's going to lead to the scientific revolution, where scientists are going to challenge the scientific beliefs of the church. And it's also going to lead to the Enlightenment, where Enlightenment philosophers question the idea of a monarch or the idea of divine right. So definitely make that connection between the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, right? But this is a great example of, again, Christianity changing a bit, right? I wouldn't say syncretism, but changing. Calvinism, John Calvin, actually he broke away from the church. I think it was before Martin Luther, around 1530. He develops again his own Christian church. Calvinism, and his belief was the idea of predestination. That actually, you had to live a moral and ethical life because you might have already been chosen to go to heaven. Calvinism inspired the Puritans. So the Puritans who came over to the Americas were big believers in Calvinism. So it's kind of related to Lutheranism, but it's a little different in that he emphasized the idea of predestination, and Lutheranism did not. The Counter-Reformation, very important. The church responds to these new sects by fighting against the Protestants. Basically, they clean up the church a little bit. They go after non-believers in the Inquisition. They basically executed people who they believed were going against the church. They did promote more missionary work. The Jesuits, who actually made their way out to China, spread the Catholic religion kind of successfully. And the Council of Trent, they corrected some of those abuses. They ended the sale of indulgences, and they concentrated on reaffirming rituals like marriage. So they basically, the Counter-Reformation was in response to Martin Luther's Reformation. They cleaned up the Catholic Church, and they tried to encourage the spread of Catholicism as far as China. Sikhism, right? Sikhism is going to emerge in India during Akbar's rule. He's going to basically combine Islam with Hinduism, right? So kind of like how Zen Buddhism combined Buddhism with I believe, with Taoism, right, or Zen, or Neo-Confucianism. So again, we see Islam here emerging with Hinduism. The idea of creating a new faith, and again combining elements of Islam, Hinduism, even Christianity and Zoroastrianism. So again, it's a new religion, but it combines old belief systems. All right, key concept 4.17. As merchants profits increased and governments collected more taxes, funding for visual and performing arts, even for popular audiences, increased along with the expansion of literacy. So just be able to show examples of the emergence of new art, perhaps patronage, where rulers would fund and promote art. So Akbar encouraged learning and art. We see during the Mughal dynasty, the Taj Mahal is created that combines Islam and local art to create these decorative and geometric designs. Chinese literature, the modern novel emerges in China around 1590. Ming pottery and Manchu wood block prints emerge. Haiku poetry in Japan also is kind of born during this time. So, again, we see a continuation of art and literature throughout the world during this time. The idea of patronage is very important, where these rulers would pay and support the arts, and I think that's something to remember. All right, that's it, guys. We'll do another lecture on 4.2 next.